The moment you stop chasing approval, your real confidence finally shows up. Welcome back to the show. Today we're talking about something that quietly shapes our confidence, our lifestyle, and relationship choices. And really, even the way we show up in our everyday lives. The need for validation. In a world that constantly measures worth through likes, reactions, compliments, and approval, it's easy to start believing that your value lives outside of you. But here's the truth. When your self-worth depends on applause, your confidence becomes a little fragile. Today's episode of Signals and Standards with Suzie is all about what I call the validation detox. Stepping out of approval-seeking patterns and reconnecting with the kind of confidence that comes from within. We're going to talk about the psychology behind why we crave validation, how it impacts our confidence, how comparison culture feeds insecurity, and most importantly, how to rebuild a relationship with yourself that doesn't rely on external approvals. By the end of this episode, you will understand how to break free from the validation loop and start trusting your own voice. So, if you've ever second-guessed yourself, maybe even waited for permission, looked for someone else's approval, or felt like your worth depended on someone else's reaction, stay with us. This one's for you. Welcome to Signals and Standards with Suzie, where we decode mixed messages, elevate your standards, and deliver practical insights that you can act on. I'm your empowerment coach, Suzie, here to guide you from confusion to clarity, helping you reclaim your power and create the relationships and life you deserve. Human beings are wired for connection. From an evolutionary standpoint, belonging to a group once meant safety and survival. So it makes sense that validation from others feels good. Psychologists explain that when we receive praise, approval, or even positive feedback, the brain releases a chemical associated with reward and motivation called dopamine. I think you've heard of that before. Research on the psychology of validation shows that this neurological response reinforces behaviors that earn approval. So this encourages us to seek that validation again and again. It feels good. In small doses, this feedback loop can absolutely be healthy. Encouragement can motivate growth. Feeling seen can deepen connection with others, for instance. But when approval becomes the foundation of your identity, something subtle but powerful shifts. Instead of living authentically, you start performing for acceptance. Think of it like living with an emotional scoreboard. Every compliment adds points. Every criticism subtracts them. And slowly, without realizing it, your sense of self becomes tied to reactions rather than reality. Instead of asking yourself whether something feels aligned with who you are, you start measuring success by whether people approve of it. Modern culture, and particularly social media, has amplified this pattern dramatically. Andrew Murphy's work on external validation highlights the hidden emotional costs of constantly seeking praise in the digital age. For example, social media platforms create a powerful comparison loop. The moment someone posts a photo, a thought, or maybe even an achievement, there's often an unconscious waiting period that follows. And yes, we all do it. With us constantly checking notifications, refreshing our screens, going back to our phones again and again, watching for likes and comments, each reaction becomes a small signal of acceptance. But when self-worth depends on that feedback, confidence becomes unstable. One day you feel affirmed and confident, the next day you feel overlooked and unsure of yourself. What makes this cycle especially tricky is that it rarely feels obvious while you're in it. It can show up quietly in everyday decisions. Maybe you hesitate to speak your mind because you want everyone to agree with you. Maybe you soften your opinions so you don't create discomfort in others, or maybe even yourself. Maybe you change your preferences, your appearance, or even your values to avoid disappointing someone. The deeper issue here isn't the validation itself. The deeper issue is the dependence on the validation. According to research, approval-seeking behaviors often start earlier in life than we realize. Many people learn that praise came when they achieved something, when they behaved in certain ways, when they said something, or they made others happy. Over time, that conditioning becomes internalized. The brain begins to equate approval with worth. Instead of asking, "What do I believe?" we start asking, "What will people think of this?" And that is where our validation detox begins. Detaching from constant approval seeking doesn't mean becoming indifferent to people or shutting down emotionally. It means reclaiming ownership of your identity. Rick Torreson's work on breaking validation habits describes it as stepping out of what he calls the approval loop, that constant cycle of checking, adjusting, and performing reactions. The more we rely on outside praise to tell us who we are, the less we practice trusting our own judgment. But the moment we begin validating ourselves first, something changes internally. Confidence becomes steadier because it's no longer tied to someone else's reaction. I like to describe it as building an internal compass. When your internal compass is external, you're constantly changing direction depending on what others approve of. One person praises you and you feel confident. Another person criticizes you and suddenly you question everything. But when your compass is internal, feedback becomes information rather than identity. You can listen to perspectives without losing yourself in them. Remember the scoreboard? Research in positive psychology on self-worth theory supports this idea. Self-worth isn't something handed to you by others. It develops through self-awareness, acceptance, and consistent alignment with your values. In other words, confidence grows when your actions reflect who you truly are, not when those actions receive applause. And this dynamic becomes especially important in relationships. I've written about how approval seeking often shows up in dating dynamics, for example, in ways people don't immediately recognize. Someone might ignore red flags because they don't want to upset the other person. They might agree with opinions they don't actually share to keep the peace. Or they might work overtime trying to be liked rather than asking more important questions, like, do I actually feel good in this relationship? When someone prioritizes being liked over being authentic, the relationship becomes imbalanced. It becomes a performance rather than a partnership. And the irony is that the more someone tries to earn approval, the less secure the connection often feels. That's because real intimacy requires authenticity. Real connection happens when someone meets the real you, not the edited version designed to keep everyone else comfortable. This is why shifting from approval seeking to self-worth can transform not only your confidence but also your relationships. One of the most powerful practices in a validation detox is learning to pause before seeking reassurance. Instead of immediately asking others what they think, check with yourself first. Do I actually like this decision? Does this align with my values? Does this feel authentic to who I am? That pause may seem small, but psychologically it's huge. It trains the brain to look inward rather than outward for direction. Therapists often recommend small daily practices to strengthen internal validation. These include acknowledging your own accomplishments privately instead of waiting for recognition, recognizing your emotions without dismissing them, and celebrating personal progress even when no one else sees it. These actions may seem simple, but they build a powerful internal foundation. Over time, they train your brain to see self-worth as something generated internally rather than granted externally. Confidence then begins to grow from the inside out. Positive psychology research on building confidence emphasizes that confidence is not a personality trait you're born with. It's a skill developed through repeated experiences of self-trust. Each time you make a decision aligned with your values, each time you honor your boundaries, each time you express your true opinion, even when it feels uncomfortable, you strengthen that skill. And here's something fascinating that often happens along the way. When people stop chasing validation, they often become more magnetic. There's something deeply compelling about someone who knows who they are and stands comfortably in truth. They're not trying to impress everyone in the room. They're simply being themselves. And that authenticity has a grounding effect on others. The goal of validation detox isn't isolation or independence from connection. It's emotional independence within connection. You can still appreciate compliments. You can still welcome encouragement. You can still enjoy recognition. You no longer need those things to define your value. And that is empowering. Let's pause for a moment. We've been talking about how seeking validation can quietly shape our confidence, our choices, and the way we show up in relationships. As you listen, you might recognize moments when you looked outside yourself for reassurance instead of trusting your instincts. That awareness is actually the first step in a validation detox. Because this shift doesn't just live in theory, it shows up in real life. It shows up in how you communicate, the boundaries you set, the choices you make when you start trusting your own voice. So let's bring this into real life with a listener question, because learning to validate yourself really begins in those everyday moments. And if this episode is stirring something in you, you can always connect to me through powercoachsuzie.com, where many of these conversations start with an honest question. Let's move into today's listener question. A listener wrote, "Why do I constantly need reassurance from people in my life? Even when things seem fine, I still feel anxious unless they tell me they care about me." First, let me say this clearly because it matters. This is incredibly common, and it doesn't mean you're needy or weak. Most of the time, it's the result of emotional conditioning. When someone has spent years trying their worth to how other people react to them, the brain starts to treat reassurance as proof of safety. A text that says, "I miss you," a compliment, or someone saying they care about you signals that everything is okay. And when that signal doesn't appear right away, the mind fills in the blanks with uncertainty. What's really happening in those moments is that your nervous system is looking for external confirmation that you're valued. But the challenge is that reassurance can temporarily calm anxiety without actually resolving it. It becomes like an emotional quick fix. It feels good for a moment, but then the brain asks for it again and again and again. So the real work in a validation detox is learning to shift that sense of safety inward. When I'm coaching someone through this, I often walk them through a small but powerful pause when that anxious feeling shows up. Instead of immediately reaching for the phone or asking for reassurance, we slow the moment down and ask a few grounding questions. First, what evidence do I already have? Has this person shown care through their actions? Have they been consistent? Often when we step back, we realize that the relationship itself has already given us signals of stability or instability. Second, What do I believe about myself right now? Because anxiety in relationships often has less to do with the other person and more to do with the story we're telling ourselves. If the inner narrative is, I'm not enough, or people eventually lose interest in me, the brain starts searching for proof of those fears. And the third question is the most important. What would it look like to trust myself in this moment? Trusting yourself might mean allowing space instead of chasing reassurance. It might mean reminding yourself that your worth isn't determined by how quickly someone replies, or it might mean recognizing that if a relationship truly isn't meeting your needs, you have the strength to address it honestly. Real confidence in dating or relationships or friendships or even work relationships doesn't come from hearing, "You're amazing," over and over and over again. It comes from knowing that you already believe that about yourself. When that internal belief grows stronger, something shifts in relationships. You're no longer asking someone to confirm your value. You're inviting them to meet you at the level of confidence and self-respect you've already built. And honestly, I realized this not too long ago. I recognized how much I had relied on other people's validation in different areas in my life. Not just in relationships, but also in work decisions, even my voice. I wanted people to be happy with me. I wanted approval. And the problem was that I wasn't always being fully true to myself because I was trying to keep everyone else comfortable and satisfied. When I finally started validating myself, my choices, my values, my instincts, everything shifted. I found the confidence to stand up for what mattered to me and my values. And it genuinely changed the direction of my life. It also made me a magnet to the right people in my life. The takeaway here is simple. When you validate yourself first, reassurance becomes a bonus and not a necessity. And when your confidence comes from within, relationships become healthier and more balanced. And recognize this doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. It's a growth process. But little by little, if you really put in that effort, it will happen. And you'll see what a difference it makes in your life. So before we close, let's anchor this conversation with something simple but powerful. Because validation detoxes don't just happen, right? It happens through repetition. Through the small moments where you consciously choose to turn inward instead of looking outside of yourself for approval. Affirmations can really help with that. They're a powerful tool, especially when you ground them in intention. So let's rebuild this foundation of self-trust. So repeat after me, and you can write this somewhere, put it where you can see it, put it on a mirror, on the fridge, on your hand, whatever. So repeat with me. I trust myself. I trust myself. I trust myself. Take a moment and actually feel the weight of those words. Self-trust is the opposite of approval seeking. When you trust yourself, you stop second-guessing every decision. You stop waiting for someone else to tell you that your feelings are valid. Your voice matters, or that your choices are worthy, or that you're worthy. This affirmation works because the brain learns through repetition. The more you remind yourself that your instincts count, the more your mind begins to internalize that belief. Over time, your internal compass becomes stronger than outside opinions. You start making decisions with clarity, without hesitating, and you show up with confidence rather than needing reassurance. And that's the real shift of a validation detox. When you trust yourself, approval becomes a nice bonus, but not a requirement for your worth. So say it loud and proud with me. I trust myself. Remember that a validation detox isn't about rejecting encouragement or pretending another person's opinion doesn't matter. It's about shifting where your sense of worth begins. Instead of waiting for the world to confirm who you are, you start becoming the one who does. And when that shift happens, something steady begins to take root. You speak a little more honestly, you make decisions with a little more clarity, you stop shrinking your voice to keep the peace. Little by little, you begin showing up in your life as the person who trusts themselves and the one who knows their worth. That is the real power of self-validation. It frees you from the exhausting cycle of constantly checking whether you measure up. Instead, you begin measuring your life by something far more meaningful, that you're living in alignment with who you truly are. And when you reach that place, confidence doesn't feel like something you're chasing anymore. It feels like something you're standing in, something so intentional. So if there's one thing I hope you take with you from today's conversation, it's this. You matter. Your voice matters. Your instincts count. And your worth does not need permission. The more you practice validating yourself, the more powerful and peaceful your life becomes. Thank you for spending this time with me today and leaning into a conversation about self-worth, confidence, and the quiet ways we sometimes give our power away by looking for approval outside of ourselves. A validation detox isn't always dramatic. It often begins with small moments of awareness, moments where you take a deep breath, pause, listen inward, and choose to trust your own voice a little more than you did before. As we explored today, real confidence grows when you stop measuring your worth by other people's reaction and start recognizing the value that already exists within you. You can catch this episode along with our quick, thoughtful Power Shot insights anytime on Signals and Standards with Suzie across your favorite podcast platforms. And if today's conversation sparked a reflection, a question, or a moment of realization about trusting yourself more fully, you can always connect through powercoachsuzie.com. I truly do read every message that comes through, and I'm here walking this journey with you as you build a life and relationships rooted in confidence, clarity, and self-validation. See you next time. For daily inspiration and practical advice, find me on social media at PowerCoachSuzie. Got questions or ideas for the show? Head to powercoachsuzie.com where you can connect with me, explore the blog, or learn more about what I do. This is Suzie signing off. Until next time, keep reading the signals and never, ever lower your standards.